You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Carl Ernst. He's a professor at University of North Carolina. We're going to talk about his work in Islamic studies with a focus on West and South Asia. So, Carl, thank you for coming. How are you doing?
I'm just doing fine, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your interest in Islamic studies, like how did it start, and what's your career been like so far?
Well, I trace it back to a experience I had when I was young. I was 16 when I went to spend a year as an exchange student in South America in Chile. And one of the things that I realized very quickly was how little I knew about the world outside of the United States. And that made me think that this is a serious deficit in our education. Most Americans are pretty terrible at locating things on a map. So then I began to think that religious studies would be, the consideration of religion would be a way to address some of the deeper issues. And eventually I came around to what is the biggest area of ignorance we have in America about another religion? And I decided that was Islam. So that was one start. And another angle that I approached this on was through poetry. I became very attracted to the wonderful tradition of Persian poetry and later Arabic. And so I ended up going to Harvard University to study religion and Islamic studies. And after that, I taught at Pomona College in Claremont for 11 years. And now I've been at University of North Carolina for almost 29 years. So it's been a terrific opportunity for me to be able to work with some of the best students in the world and the best scholars in the world. And I've really enjoyed it.
So what your interests currently are surrounding Islamic studies, or what's the current focus of your research?
Well, I've become really fascinated with an example that's kind of in my backyard in North Carolina, which is a study of the Arabic writings of an African Muslim scholar who was sold into slavery in 1807 in Charleston after being taken from West Africa, from Senegal. And while he was in North Carolina, he wrote an autobiography in Arabic in the 1830s, as well as other documents. And so I'm working with a colleague right now at Duke nearby who's from Senegal, and we're going to publish a book on his writings, the writings of this really interesting figure, whose name was Omar ibn Said. And we expect this is going to be, it's going to have a real impact.
Oh, what was interesting about his writings that you discovered so far?
Well, they've been looked at by people over the years, but frankly, not very profoundly. But we discovered that Omar was quoting some remarkably difficult and sophisticated writings on grammar, on law, on theology, and on mysticism. And so this suddenly made us realize, it's all from memory, by the way, and he was enslaved for over 50 years while he was in America. So he had this library in his head that he had memorized, and he would write out these messages which nobody could understand. So it must have been very frustrating for him, but it's part of our history now. And so I think we need to become aware of it, especially at a time when the issue of racism has come to the forefront. And I think we need to understand our backgrounds better.
Well, what do you mean he was writing about his experience in the U.S. as part of slavery, or was he writing about his religion, or what was he writing about?
Well, you have to remember that it was actually illegal for slaves to be educated, to learn to read and write. And he was asked to write about his life. So this was not writing from choice. And furthermore, there was hardly anybody who could understand the Arabic that he was writing. There were a handful of people who were missionaries and amateur scholars. But to write for an audience that doesn't understand you is basically kind of impossible. And so he would, in his so-called autobiography, he actually addresses his old friends at home. He says, "Oh, my brothers, you must forgive me because I have forgotten much." Although he goes on to quote a very significant Arabic text on attributes of God. But nobody could catch this reference in the last 200 years. And so then he says something that is addressed to, he says, "Oh, people of South Carolina, people of North Carolina, people of America, and you're waiting for an important message from him. But the only thing he can say in that situation is, my master is a very good master. In other words, his relationship with the people of America is limited to slavery, and a slave cannot speak on his own authority.
Well, he wasn't, I mean, was he a black Muslim, or did he look Arab, or did he look black? Was he mistaken for like
Well, you've asked a very interesting point. Well, some people recognized him. He was from West Africa. So he's like somebody you would meet in Senegal today, although he was apparently a slight man and short and not very heavy, because he found it really difficult to do hard physical labor. But people said, wait a minute, he's able to read and write because he ran away from an abusive slave master and was thrown into jail in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and he covered the walls with writing. But this man can read and write. He can't actually be an African because they didn't believe that Africans had any culture. So they made up stories about him. They said, well, he's probably an Arab prince who got lost somehow. Or maybe he's an Indian prince. But they fantasized, about him being a prince, because the idea of an aristocrat being reduced to slavery was somehow dramatic or satisfying in some sense. And the other thing is that they wanted to tell themselves a story about him, that he had converted to Christianity, which in their view would make slavery just perfectly fine because he ultimately benefited by his salvation.
So who recognized that he wasn't, I guess, quote unquote, I guess they call them savages, but who recognized that he was able to read and write and understand? Was it his master, and was it way after the fact, after he passed away? When did this happen?
Well, when he was initially thrown into jail in Fayetteville, that would have been 1810. People were astonished that somebody could write something on the walls that had no idea what language it was. But somebody figured out it was Arabic. And so he became a privileged person in the slave hierarchy. So he didn't have to work in the fields, but he was sort of a semi-intimate of the family, of the Owens family. And when they had visitors, this is a very prominent family. His brother was the governor of North Carolina. When they had visitors, which included many ministers at the time, he would say, Omar, why don't you write out one of those strange things you can do in Arabic? And they would ask for him to write out something like the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalm. And sometimes he would write out something else, or else he would write out a passage from the Bible, which had as a preface Islamic prayer formulas. They couldn't read this stuff, but they found it so exotic, and he'd kind of come to terms with his fate that he wasn't going to get any way to return to Africa. So it's a very poignant story, and I have to say I found it to be quite mesmerizing.
So they recognized when he was in jail in Fayetteville that, again, he was literate and at least somewhat educated, but did anyone do anything for him? Did they intervene on his behalf, or it was just a curiosity and he got out and that was that? Like what happened in this guy's life at that point and afterwards?
Well, he was technically a runaway slave, and so they didn't want him to be going out on his own. And so Jim Owen, who was the brother of the future governor, decided he pulled together the money to purchase him. And so Omar stayed with the Owen family until his death in 1863, and he was buried in their family funeral plot. And he was apparently respected and admired and well liked by people. He was a dignified man who had an impressive bearing, and so he moved with them from Fayetteville to Wilmington in the 1830s. And there were dozens of articles written about him in newspapers, but they were mostly fantasy because nobody could read what he wrote.
So were all his writings assembled after his death, or like how did you get a hold of them? And how did you even find out that this man had a body of writings?
Well, to be honest, it's good luck that we have of what we do. There are 18 documents that have survived. His autobiography is the longest one. It's not very long, actually, but it was lost for 80 years. And it turned up in an attic in 1995, and a collector picked it up at an auction. And now it's been, since that collector died a couple of years ago, it was sold again by Sotheby's, and it's now in the Library of Congress, where they've established a collection of documents that surround this. But I have to say that it's sort of disturbing to see how we have records of at least a dozen other documents that people talk about owning, but which are not located and nobody knows where they were. I think that the carelessness with which these documents were treated is a sign of the indifference and disregard that they had for the intellectual qualities of this man. So the largest number of documents that we have by him were preserved by the children of the Owen family, who were his slave owners. So they were the ones who were the most interested in keeping him.
How much writing is there? Like, have you started going through it, or like, where are you at in the process of going through everything?
We've translated all of it, and we have also established the Arabic text, which we'll publish on a digital form online for the first time. Most of the documents are 1 or 2 pages in length, and the longest ones are a letter of 1819, which is probably about 4 pages in length, and then the autobiography is around 15 or 20 pages. But it's just sheer luck that these have been preserved. Kind of amazingly, one document came on the market just about a month or so ago, and I'm happy to say that the University of North Carolina has acquired it, and we now have it in our library. That was something which was passed down by a clergyman to his heirs, and somebody eventually sold it for. Now it's become a very collectible item.
Have you gone through the documents and read through them? And
yeah,
what have you discovered that was interesting going through them?
Well, let me give you an example. In his first letter, which he wrote to the Owen brothers, he quotes a poem that was written by a Sufi master from North Africa in the 12th century. And we know that this was a popular poem because there are dozens of manuscripts that have been identified of this same poem in Mali and have been digitized by the Hill Manuscript Library in Minnesota, which collects manuscripts from around the world. And in this poem, it's a kind of a sermon that's addressed to people who are in need of salvation. And so the poet Abu Madian says, "You who is turning gray, you who are turning gray, what are you waiting for? Have you not seen the fate of those before you? Either you're crazy or you're an idiot. Your beard is white, but your heart is black." Now, this is addressed to the slave owner, and it's a sermon where he's leading up to the point, which is he wants them to send him back to Africa. He wants to go back to his home, but they couldn't read it. It was not translated for nearly 200 years. And so what I find amazing about that is, number one, he knew this by heart, and he could write this down in a letter after, a dozen years a slave in America. Number two, he's unafraid to say something that's pretty harsh to a slave owner. And number three, nobody could understand it because they all pretended or claimed that he didn't ever want to go back to Africa. But we have it right down there in his own writing. And who would we believe in this case?
Well, do you know if they asked him or if they didn't even ask him and they just assumed? Or
Well, we only know what they say in their letters and their newspaper publications. But it's amazing because they wanted so badly to tell themselves a story in which he converted to Christianity and therefore was happy that he was a slave. They wanted to be able to tell that story. So they I think they fantasized this. They convinced themselves that he didn't want to go back. So I can only suppose that if the subject came up, he was diplomatic. I mean, he couldn't, have a fit and start attacking people. But it's so amazing to see how absolutely contradicted they are by what he said. So the voice of the slave has been effectively unheard for the last 2 centuries. And so now we're going to try to change that.
did the family, so were they just writing about everyday happenings, or was he their only slave, or was he in particular one that affected them and that's why they wrote about him? Like, what do you think their motivation was for writing about this?
We have some photographs of him, which are in the University of North Carolina library collection. He's dressed in somewhat exotic clothing, which are apparently based upon what he used to wear in Africa. And they had over 60 slaves, each of the brothers, which is pretty high in North Carolina terms in those days. It's probably in the top 1 or 2% of slave owners in the state. So they had plenty of people we've been tracking that. They're listed in the census, male and female slaves. They have records of the children born to their slaves. And he was the one who was in the house who apparently was privileged. And he wrote in his autobiography that they dress me the way they dress themselves. They feed me the way they feed themselves. And so he was treated very exceptionally. And his writings are all addressed to the white slave owning class. He doesn't talk about the other Africans who he would have had contact with. In this respect, he's different there's a handful of other African Muslims who wrote in Arabic during the early 19th century, and some of them are writing to their community of fellow believers. And are talking about community practices. Omar was isolated, I think. He was mostly staying with the rich white slave owners who told him to stay there. And therefore, he's a very unusual figure. But there's a lot of interest in him locally. There's a mosque named after him in Fayetteville. And there's an institute that's just been established with his name by some social activists in Chicago. And there's an opera that has been written about him that is supposed to premiere at the Spoleto Festival this spring, written by the musician Rhiannon Gibbons. So I think the time has come for Omar to be back and to be understood finally.
These are the writings going to be put on exhibit with, is there going to be events surrounding him?
We
you
hope
mentioned
so.
spring, but,
Yeah.
I guess maybe it's postponed till this coming year, but I would guess, your work on his writings, and then, if you contact the other organizations that bear his name, I mean, perhaps there would be an event that you could put on.
That's a great idea. I mean, we have 3 of the 18 writings here in North Carolina and Chapel Hill, but the others are scattered in different places. There's the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh. There's the Public Library in Wilmington. There is the Spartanburg County Historical Association, of all things. That's in South Carolina. And so there's a lot of places that we'd have to pull into this, as well as Yale University and Harvard. They have a couple of up there.
Well, if you do a swap whereby you offer not only the writings that are local to you, but your interpretation of them, and then ask these other holders of the other writings if you can get, let's say, a digital copy, or if you can go visit the copy for a bit of time and then do your own interpretation, you could probably get all these together. It would take some effort and time, but you could probably get all these together, I guess, and then put on a pretty significant event, remembering his writings and everything.
Well, I should get you to come down and help us, Richard. It's great ideas.
Yeah, I know. Easy for me to say because I'm not there. But,
No, I appreciate it. But
hopefully there would be courtesy because you're a scholar and whoever holds these other pieces. I'm sure you could ask.
There's a way to do this kind of thing, and we would do it through our library because they can have an exhibit that has the proper security, and that's the way you have to do it.
Gotcha.
But
yeah.
What is interesting is when I tell people this story, they find it very surprising at first, because I think people have had the impression that those Africans who were unfortunate enough to end up in slavery in America were largely from rural areas and uneducated and so forth. And that doesn't make it any better to be a slave. The idea that an educated person would be in that position is disturbing, and people find it to be, it really gets their attention. And especially when I'm telling this to people around North Carolina, it has a personal impact on them. So that is the quality of a story that needs to be told. If it already, just by its very nature, grabs people's attention and it makes them wonder how on earth this ever could have happened.
Very good, Carl. Where can people find out at least your interpretation of the writings that you have? Is it, I don't know if it's public yet, but where can people go to learn more?
Well, if they go to my website, if they look up my website begins with Carl W. Ernst, ERNST, without any punctuation. They can find my website, and I have some material there, including some interviews. And so we're starting to put things together, and I'm hoping we'll have the Arabic up within a month. It's been rather challenging, but we have a project at the University of Maryland, which has a strong team of computer specialists. And so we're going to put this together, first of all, in Arabic. And I just want to underline that one of the implications of this work is that Arabic is a language that has a history in America, not just because of Omar, but there's a handful of other people from his time as well. And then in the 19th century, with the growth of immigration from the area of Syria, Palestine, and nearby countries, Arabic has become part of American history. And so intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson were interested in this type of material, Ralph Waldo Emerson and others. So I think this is a recognizable part of the world cultural heritage that Americans have access to and can legitimately explore as part of our own history. And just in order to appreciate what Omar wrote, we've identified about 7 different authors that he quotes that were previously unrecognized. Writers from Egypt, from Iraq, from Morocco, and other countries. I mean, it shows you the networks of intellectual culture that were going on.
Yeah, that's amazing.
His slave owners did get for him an Arabic Bible, which had been produced by a missionary society in London. Although the translations of the Hebrew Bible in that volume, some of them dated back to the great Jewish scholar Saadia Gaon, who lived in Baghdad in the 10th century. So translations of the Torah were done by this Jewish scholar 1,000 years ago. That's kind of interesting.
Wow. What was the Arabic that he wrote in modern Arabic, or was it like an ancient form or a different form?
Well, it was pretty much classical Arabic that we would study in a classroom, not the spoken language of the street, which is quite different, but the handwriting is a particular variety of calligraphy, which is called Maghrebi, or from the northwest of Africa. And you have to practice at it to get used to it, because it looks different from standard Arabic of the Syria, Egyptian region. But I'll tell you one other thing that's really surprising is the way he writes Arabic in Arabic letters. He uses Arabic letters to write down English names and words, and you can hear a Southern accent in the way that he understood this, because he didn't know how to read English, so he couldn't just substitute an Arabic letter for an English one. He was trying to copy the sound.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So he has a date that he gives in his letter of 1819, and here's how it would sound pronounced by an Arabic speaker: November 4, 1819. In other words, November 4, 1819.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's amazing. That's pretty cool that you can literally hear how he would have written certain things. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, and he addresses the slaveholders. He calls them sheikh, and then he calls them general, because one of them, Jim Owen, had a military appointment. So he writes Sheikh General Jim Owen. So there is an interesting mixture of titles.
Well, very good. Well, Carl, it's been an interesting call. We're at the end of the time. So again, just to recap, where can people go to find out more about your work in particular, and then we'll wrap.
Okay, well, my website is carlwernst.web.unc.edu. But if you just look up Carl W. Ernst, you'll find me. I'm the only one with that particular combination. And so I've got some interviews and some links and some articles and books on a lot of other subjects in Islamic studies as well. But I really appreciate the chance to talk about this project, which I've been working on for the last couple of years. Colleague at Duke, Dr. M. Lowe. So hopefully we'll get this out in published form and lead it to an opening of this really fascinating subject of these figures who were enslaved in America and who wrote about it in Arabic. Quite a combination.
Yeah, definitely. Very good. Well, Carl, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.